Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's April 18th, 2025. Before we dive into our main topic for this episode, I want to rectify something I left out when I was covering infidelity and the propensity for infidelity among women. When I looked at the General Social Survey last week, inexplicably, I forgot to include political orientation. Like the other conclusions we came to when we looked at this data last week, the stereotypes tend to be borne out here. They don't exist for no reason. And in the case of political orientation, it's no different than those other things that we looked at previously. For self-described liberal women, over 16% say that they have cheated on a spouse, compared to just 9.8% of conservative women. So liberal women are almost twice as likely to cheat as conservative women are. Moderates, self-described moderates, come in right down the middle at 12.7% having cheated. So add that to the attributes that you are seeking if you are seeking a woman who will remain faithful to you, that she be politically conservative.
First topic is democracy, or defending democracy, or we had to subvert democracy to save democracy. We're going to talk about Romania, Turkey, Ukraine, and Brazil, and France. And I'll start with Romania. So, Călin Georgescu, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing any of these names. So, Georgescu ran in Romania as an independent candidate in the 2024 presidential elections. And his views, I think it's fair to describe as pro-Russian, anti-NATO. He has been described as a right-wing populist, an ultranationalist. And initially he was kind of dismissed or not even really considered a threat. He was polling around 5%. But he ultimately won 23%, which was the most votes in the first round of voting. And so because of this, he was accused, his campaign was accused of having Russian influence, and he was accused of having election infrastructure experiencing cyber attacks believed to originated from a, quote, state actor. And so they essentially, the powers that be in Romania blamed Russia for interfering in the election. And so the Constitutional Court of Romania annulled the results of the first round on December 6th. And then in February of this year, 2025, Georgescu was detained by police, and he was charged with a series of offenses, including, quote, incitement to actions against the constitutional order. He was given a 60-day ban on media appearances, and he, after that, filed his candidacy for 2025 presidential election, but he was barred from running by the Central Election Bureau in March. And at this time, when he was disqualified, he was still leading in opinion polls. And so Romania is currently preparing for a rerun of its presidential election. It's scheduled for May 4th. And then there's a potential runoff scheduled for May 18th. Next, Brazil. I'm referencing a news article from the Wall Street Journal from March 26th. The Brazilian Supreme Court ordered that former President Jair Bolsonaro go on trial for allegedly plotting a coup in the country. The justices ruled in a hearing that Bolsonaro should stand trial on 5 charges over allegations that the leader plotted a military takeover of the country in 2022 to prevent the current president, Lula da Silva, from taking office. And so the 70-year-old former president, Bolsonaro, was charged with leading an armed criminal organization, attacking the democratic state, plotting a coup, destroying federal property, and damaging historical landmarks. Bolsonaro, who had been an army captain during a 21-year dictatorship that ended in 1985, denied the allegations and accused da Silva's government and the courts of carrying out a witch hunt to prevent his return to power. And da Silva, the current president of Brazil, his job approval rating has dropped to an all-time low of 24%. And Bolsonaro was already banned from running for office in 2023, and he remains quite popular. He very narrowly lost re-election in 2022, and there is a very high chance that if he were allowed to run, he would win. Next, we have France, and here again I'm pulling from the Wall Street Journal reporting on this. A French court convicted Marine Le Pen of misusing European Union funds, banning her from the next presidential election. And the sentence from the court in France barred Le Pen from seeking public office for the next 5 years. She also received a 4-year prison sentence, with half of that term being suspended so that she can serve part of it with an electronic bracelet. Elon Musk commented on this. He said, quote, "When the radical left can't win via democratic vote, they abuse the legal system to jail their opponents. This is their standard playbook throughout the world." Marine Le Pen is the leader of the National Rally Party, which I believe is now the second most popular party in France. They currently hold 123 of the total 577 seats in the National Assembly, making it, it's actually the lower house's single largest party. Marine Le Pen is seen as by far the biggest threat to Emmanuel Macron and his party. Next, we'll turn to Turkey. Again, I'm pulling from the Wall Street Journal reporting on this. In March 2025, Ekrem İmamoğlu, who is the mayor of Istanbul and is a major political rival to the current president of Turkey, Recep Erdogan, So İmamoğlu, the mayor of Istanbul, was arrested on charges of corruption and alleged ties to the PKK, which is a designated terrorist organization in Turkey. And the arrest came just as he was expected to be nominated as the opposition's presidential candidate for the 2028 election. And this arrest has triggered nationwide protests, with many Turks seeing the move as a politically motivated attempt to eliminate Erdogan's top challenger. And Turkey's main opposition party condemned the arrest as a, quote, civilian coup, and nominated İmamoğlu as their candidate regardless of him being arrested. And there has been deafening silence from the European leaders, who normally would, in the past, have not been shy about speaking out against alleged abuses of Erdogan. This time around, they're staying quiet. You've heard very little criticism from Europeans, the political elite, about what's happening in Turkey. And I think the reason is because of the Ukraine-Russia situation and NATO, because Turkey has NATO's second largest army, and it's crucial for European security, especially when Trump is indicating that he's not going to provide as much military support to NATO. And Trump has also obviously signaled more willingness to accommodate Russia and potentially wrap up the Ukrainian war, the war in Ukraine. So if Europe is serious about taking over, taking the lead in defeating Russia, they're going to need the assistance of Turkey. And so I think that explains why, like I said, there's been very little pushback from the European elites on what's happening in Turkey, despite it being a pretty obvious attack on democracy, which is what the people advocating for Ukraine claim to be fighting for. And Turkey has taken a pretty balanced approach, relatively, to the Ukraine-Russia war. They have not joined in sanctions against Moscow, and so has facilitated trade and technology into Russia. But at the same time, Turkey has supported Ukraine and has sold weapons to it, and has banned Russian warships from entering the Black Sea. And lastly, we have Ukraine, which has suspended presidential elections, is operating under martial law, has banned opposition parties, opposition press, has forcefully conscripted many Ukrainians into the military. And so in all of these cases, when obviously anti-democratic things are occurring, at the same time, all all the forces, all the people, all the entities exercising these anti-democratic powers are claiming that they are acting in the interest of democracy and that they are the Democrats. And so succinctly, like I said at the beginning, I think it's a situation of having to subvert democracy in order to save democracy. What do you think, Ness?
I think the definition of democracy in this context is what is preferable by the neoliberal establishment in the Western world. This isn't new. It's not new in the history of democracy, and it's not even new in modern history. It's not new in the history of the 21st century. After the so-called Arab Spring in the early teens, in places like Egypt, elections were held, and specifically in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood came out on top, and a coup occurred, a military coup occurred that the West and the United States supported, and General Sisi is still the president to this day of Egypt, even though he wasn't elected. It was a military coup that installed him, so that was an early example in the modern era of democracy being overturned because the results were inconvenient. If we look at Ukraine and compare it to Russia, in Russia, even Western polling institutions admit that Vladimir Putin's approval rating is far higher than that of any figure in the Western world, any major leading political figure, any political figure at all in the Western world. Putin's got an approval rating in the 70s or in the 80s, and he consistently wins by massive margins in elections that are held, and his party wins in massive margins in elections that are held. In Russia, comparable polling numbers are not something that we're able to come by now in Ukraine, but even so, I would bet my entire net worth that any honest survey of the geographic region of Ukraine, and excluding the areas that have been occupied by Russia, just the western half of Ukraine, that if honest approval rating polling was done of Zelensky, that it would be much, much lower than the current approval rating of Putin by the citizens of those respective countries. It's a feature rather than a bug of the modern managerial state to have a situation where there are so many laws. Well, there have been books written about how the average American breaks X number of laws on any given day, just going about his normal daily routine. And of course, the vast majority of these legal infractions are not prosecuted. But that, again, is a feature rather than a bug, because it means that anytime you want to pin a crime on someone to get them out of the way for political reasons, you can do that. And if this sounds Soviet, it's because in a lot of ways it is. The famous Beria quote about showing him the man and he'll show you the crime. That is increasingly the dynamic that's at play in the Western world, where anyone who is operating in opposition to the managerial state or the neoliberal establishment or the bureaucratic state, whatever term you want to use to describe the institutional power structure, that anything that is in opposition to that structure is able to be taken out by finding or inventing, or some combination of the two, a transgression that the opposition figure has committed or is alleged to have committed, and then use that to remove them from the democratic process while still singing the praises of democracy and then running democratic processes after these opposition figures have been removed, and then consecrating the results as if they show that this is the outcome of the democratic process. And so it is legitimate because it was a democratic process that gave us Macron, even though we removed Marine Le Pen from the election, or same dynamic in Georgia or in Romania or in Turkey or in Great Britain with UKIP or in the United States with Donald Trump. If democracy really was the the leading value, if it was the guiding light, then populism would be something that the power structure would embrace. Because by its very definition, populism tends to be things that are popular among the general public. But populism consistently is a force that is described in negative terms, dismissively, as an insult. And the leaders that are removed on these various legal pretexts are often described as populists. And so semantically, they're kind of giving the game away up front. It's hard to look at political processes in the Western world today and give any credulity to the idea that democracy is what is driving them. Again, democracy is better viewed as a synonym for what the power structure wants. Whatever it blesses is democratic, and whatever it opposes is anti-democratic.
Next topic, we're going to return to Frisco, Texas to give an update on the horrible stabbing of Austin Metcalf. So brief recount of what happened. About 2 weeks ago at some sort of sporting event at a high school in Frisco, Texas, there was the facts are still coming out, but there was some sort of dispute or altercation between a white kid, Austin Metcalf, and a black kid, Carmelo Anthony. And there was the Metcalf told Carmelo to get out of Carmelo was in the wrong tent, and it ended with Carmelo stabbing Metcalf in the heart and killing Metcalf. And so Carmelo Anthony was arrested. He was had a bail hearing in front of a black judge, and the black judge slashed his bail dramatically, and so Carmelo Anthony is now out of jail. So the Anthony family has gotten on board. I don't even know what you'd call it, but they have this man named Dominique Alexander representing their family. It's not in a legal sense. I don't believe he's an attorney, but he's sort of being their spokesperson. And so I'm reading from a New York Post article, which they dug into this man. He's apparently a minister, Dominique Alexander, the appointed spokesperson for the alleged teen murder, has previously been charged with multiple felonies for which he served almost zero prison time. Back in 2009, Alexander was arrested for shaking and hitting the 2-year-old child of his then-girlfriend. Then he was convicted of the charges in 2011. He got 2 years of probation from a Dallas court. And then in 2016, Alexander was sentenced to 2 years in prison for multiple violations of that probation, but only served 8 days in prison. Then in January 2013, he was indicted on felony forgery charges. And 2017, the minister was arrested on felony theft charges of property between $2,500 and $30,000. And then most recently, in 2019, Alexander was indicted indicted on felony assault charges in a domestic violence case stemming from his actions against then-girlfriend and baby mama Kiara D. Saunders. So Saunders accused Alexander of pushing, choking, and headbutting her during several altercations, but ultimately the case did not go to trial. And so so that's a bit of background on Alexander. He's the president and CEO of Next Generation Action Network, which has come to the side of 17-year-old Carmelo Anthony. And yesterday, April 17th, Alexander held a news conference on the case, and in attendance was Jeff Metcalf, Austin Metcalf, the slain teenage white boy's father. And if you recall from a couple weeks ago when we first covered this story, Jeff Metcalf has already forgiven Carmelo Anthony for killing his son. So Jeff Metcalf stood in the audience of this press conference, and I don't know the exact details. I'm not sure if there's video of the entire event, but the police led Jeff Metcalf out of the building. And then after the police had escorted Jeff Metcalf out, Alexander got on stage, and I'm going to play a clip of what he said, of what Alexander, the minister representing the Carmelo Anthony family.
And all I'm going to say, so it don't be asked later, is that was disrespectful and just shows you all the character who is not invited. He knows that it's inappropriate to be near this family, but he did it. And so I say to people, actions speak louder than words. Okay? What he has failed into is the political operatives that want to make this thing a political thing of hate, yet bigotry, and yet racism. We have conservative operatives that have been posting non-stop about this case.
That was the Anthony family spokesman. Now I'm going to play a clip of Anthony's mother. She also spoke at the press conference.
In wake of this tragic incident, our family has been under attack. Whatever you think what happened between Carmelo and the Metcalf boys, my 3 younger children, my husband, and I didn't do anything to deserve to be threatened, harassed, and lied about. The lies and false accusations that have been said about us, especially over the past week, has been overwhelming. The lies and their amplification put my family in danger, as well as everyone in our community, everyone involved in the investigation, from the police, the attorneys, and the court staff. Our address and my husband's previous employer's address has been put on all social media platforms. My husband had to take a leave of absence because he's afraid what may happen to our family. His mental health is deteriorating day by day. We have endured death threats. My 13-year-old daughter is afraid to sleep in her own bedroom because she's fearful of what may happen to her.
So I have a few thoughts before I get Ness's thoughts on this. First, it takes a lot of chutzpah for a family whose son murdered a teenager to get up and play the victim card, which is what Carmelo Anthony's mother appears to be doing. She seems to express almost no remorse for Jeff Metcalf or his son who was just killed. Instead, she talks about how difficult this whole situation has been on her and her family. There's another thing. There's been a lot of talk in the UK, at least, about this show on Netflix called Adolescence. Full disclosure, I have not watched it. I'm not planning on watching it. I'm not opposed to watching it. I just haven't done so. But it depicts a incel, young preteen/teen white British kid who gets called an incel by a female classmate, and he reacts with furious anger and lashes out and stabs and kills this female classmate. And there's been some dispute on whether the show Adolescence is based on a real-life occurrence in the UK, but there was a real-life occurrence of a black British kid stabbing another classmate. But, of course, when they made the show, they race-swapped and made the killer a white boy. And so it got me thinking. There's a big debate now, I guess, in the UK about how this show Adolescence should be shown in schools, and the Prime Minister Keir Starmer has raved about it and talked about how it has a lot to teach British society about dealing with young men and their rage and incel culture and everything like that. And in case you don't know, incel is short for involuntary celibacy, and it basically means men who can't get laid, can't form relationships with women. And Andrew Tate is thrown in there a lot, toxic masculinity. There is a lot to discuss there, but what I thought about in this case was you have a real-life incident in the UK of a black kid stabbing someone. Then you have a real-life incident in the United States about a black kid stabbing someone. But, of course, popular culture, when they depict any sort of stabbing, they make the perpetrator white. And you hear talk from Black Lives Matter activists that the United States, 150 years after slavery, 60 plus years after Jim Crow, that America remains a white supremacist society. It's hard to square a white supremacist society letting a black 17-year-old who stabbed and killed a white kid, let him out on bail and let him walk around his house freely, and let his family give these victimhood press conferences, and the father of the white victim coming in, standing, not doing anything, just observing the press conference, and the white father immediately forgiving the killer. It's hard to imagine that would occur in a white supremacist society.
The comments there about the adolescence show in Great Britain depicting a man bites dog story where the demographics of criminality and dysfunctional social behavior are inverted from reality brought to mind a recurring theme that Steve Saylor wrote about in the mid and late aughts about how for several years in a row on the popular show at the time, CSI, that there were more murders, convicted murderers on the television show in New York City for, again, 3 or 4 years consecutively than there actually were convicted white murderers in the city of New York during the same period of time. As far as what Carmelo Anthony's family is doing, there is a concept in strategic gaming called EV, or expected value, and it is a fancy way of creating a framework where you look at any given situation, weigh your particular options. It's a probabilistic measure by definition because it has as a prerequisite for its use the understanding that there is some level of variance in the outcome. So there is no expected value in a game of chess. When you move a certain piece, you want to move a certain piece in a certain direction, you know that's exactly where that piece is going to go. But with something where there are other forces in operation, there are potential moves you can make, but you don't know exactly how they are going to play out and how others are going to respond to them. If we look at what this case on the merits legally presents for the family, for Carmelo Anthony's family, he had a knife on his person at a public school athletic event in a world where there are countless stories of kids being expelled for days or weeks at a time because they had a pocket knife in their backpack. They didn't brandish it against anyone. They didn't threaten to use it against anyone. It just fell out of the backpack in the hall, or somebody saw it and it was reported to an authority figure and the child was removed or punished. We are well into the era of zero tolerance for any sort of potential weapon being on a student in a school event. And yet he had a knife on his person. He was in a location he wasn't supposed to be in. He goaded Austin Metcalf into trying to make him move. Then after he stabbed Metcalf, he threw his weapon away into the bleachers to try to discard the evidence. And then when he was accosted by police, he reportedly asked before anything else if he had a viable self-defense claim, if that strategy would work. And the presumption should be that, I think a baseline presumption, Jeff would know this better than me, for self-defense is that the person executing the alleged self-defense thinks definitively that he is in fact acting in self-defense. And so if he's asking about it afterwards and asking how it looks and if it could be conceived of as being self-defense, that sounds like pretty good evidence that he is at the very least uncertain of whether or not he was acting in self-defense. And so legally, all this evidence looks to line up in such a way that there is going to be very little chance that if the facts are all laid bare and adjudicated in a court of law that is objective, that Carmelo Anthony will be convicted of, at the very least, manslaughter and quite possibly second-degree murder. And so that is not the game that the Anthony family is going to want to have played. A much better tact for them to take is to, instead of turning this into a legalistic question about evidence and the law, to instead turn it into a proxy for racial feelings, racial sentiments in the United States. And that is a court case, as it were, that plays out in corporate media and in public, not in a courtroom setting. And a lot of other elements are at play, and pressures can be brought to bear. Jury intimidation is a big part of that. Had the jurors in the Derek Chauvin case, the police officer who was convicted of murdering George Floyd, had any of those jurors voted to acquit or held their ground so that a mistrial had occurred, there is zero doubt in my mind that they would have been publicly doxxed and harassed, and worse, that all of the racial vengeance energy that had been pent up in that case would, if not able to be exploded all over Chauvin, would have transferred to any jurors who had the audacity to follow the facts of the case and rule in Chauvin's favor. Those jurors could very well have their lives ruined, if not ended outright. Instead, what ended up happening is multiple jurors from that case went on to publicly talk about why they made the decisions they did, and they did so to great fanfare, and they were hosted on corporate media platforms and lauded for the decision that they came to. And so the EV of the jurors is another thing to be taken into account. And in a high-profile, racially charged case like this, and the more racially charged and more contentious culturally the case becomes, the more attention is going to be focused on the jurors. Well, for them, the expected value of convicting Carmelo Anthony is very negative, potentially very negative. Their lives could be ruined. But if they vote to acquit, then there will be no consequences that accrue to them at all. And it only takes one juror who is dead set against convicting Anthony from the get-go for reasons of racial loyalty or racial resentment against the perceived ruling structure in America to result in a mistrial and subsequent months or years before the case is brought again, if it's even brought again at all. Meanwhile, Anthony and his family cash in on the massive donations that they've received from these crowdfunding sites, and they become minor celebrities in their own right. There is a concept of the ghetto lottery where family members of blacks behaving badly who meet the business end of a police encounter or vigilante justice, that they end up suing the municipalities that are legally responsible for the death of their family member or friend, and the city, on behalf of the police department, ends up paying a multi-million-dollar settlement to, say, the mother or the baby mama of the man who was killed in a scuffle with police. This is a new take on that idea of the ghetto lottery, where it doesn't take someone's death to purchase that lottery ticket, but in fact, the person can make their own luck by killing someone else and cashing in on it. Instead of being killed and then having a next of kin cash in, now you can just do the killing directly and make a killing for that killing.
Speaking of that one juror who will cause a mistrial, The killing occurred in Collin County, Texas, which is a suburb of Dallas. The population of the county is over 1 million, and the racial breakdown as of 2020 in Collin County is as follows: about 51% white, about 10% black, about 18% Asian, and the other demographics, about 16% Hispanic, and then the remainder, a few very small. So that's the demographics of Collin County, Texas. So based on those figures, you would expect either 1 or 2 black jury members. And given the high-profile nature of this case, I can't imagine any resident of Collin County who hasn't heard of this. I wonder if there will be an attempt by either party to get a change of venue to potentially get a more neutral jury pool to draw from. But one could easily see a repeat 30 years later of an O.J. Simpson situation where the black jury members, despite overwhelming evidence of the black man's guilt, voting to acquit.
If the white boy talks shit, you must acquit.
Indeed. So I'm wondering if the family of Carmelo Anthony knew about the criminal background of this Alexander fellow who they appointed as their spokesperson. I wonder how he even got involved in the first place. Maybe he was just quick on his feet and set up the GoFundMe page and got to the family quickly, and before they really knew what was happening, they brought him on board, and then maybe they have since learned about his background and perhaps regret it, or maybe they don't regret it. Maybe they don't care, or maybe it's a feature, not a bug, of their whole strategy.
Returning to the EV analysis, if the intention is to turn this into a racially charged issue that is a racial proxy for racial resentment in the United States, then having someone lead the charge who is controversial is a feature rather than a bug, because it brings more attention to this case. It makes it a national story. It makes it more high profile, and it makes it more likely that a higher percentage of people will hear about it, have strong feelings about it, and bring their preconceived notions to it in the jury selection process. And all the Anthony family needs, again, is one stout juror who refuses on grounds of racial loyalty to convict Anthony of anything, and the Anthony family wins with either a mistrial or even a self-defense not guilty verdict. And there are calculations, too, that the prosecutor, the DA, will have to make. There is a conceivable path for the DA to split the difference by giving outward appearances of wanting to prosecute Anthony, but throwing the case at the outset by, during the jury selection process, not being vigilant to ensure that a handful of racially aware BLM supporters are among the jurors, and therefore guaranteeing effectively that there will be either a not guilty verdict or a mistrial. And so the DA can look like, hey, I'm trying to prosecute here, but the justice system, even if it's imperfect, it played out and there's nothing else I can do. My hands are tied. And so he can avoid the criticism of looking like he is just bowing directly to the mob while still actually bowing to the mob. The district attorney of Collins County, Texas, who presumably would be the one prosecuting this case, is an elected Republican who, based on physiognomy alone and nothing else, looks like exactly the type of prosecutor who would take this angle to give the appearance of trying to allow justice to take its course, but without any intention of bringing any of the fallout on himself of what a guilty conviction would inevitably bring.
Before we sign off, Carmelo Anthony, when he goes to trial, guilty or not guilty? I'll make my prediction. I think he will be found guilty of murder.
While I certainly would not put any money on the outcome, I think it's more likely than not that he will be either acquitted or that a mistrial will occur. to hedge my bet a little bit, I could also see a situation where he ends up being convicted of involuntary manslaughter, some lesser charge like that, and because he was a minor at the time of the incident, that he ends up not serving any time at all and gets some sort of probation or diversion. I am black-pilled and cynical enough, though, that I think it's more likely than not that he will not be convicted of first or second degree murder.
Self-defense seems to be the only possible defense in this case, and I don't know about Texas specifically, but generally self-defense has to be is judged from a reasonable person standard. So it's not whether Carmelo Anthony in his mind thought that he was in fear of his life, but whether a reasonable person in his position would have felt deadly force was justified in that situation. And I don't believe a reasonable person would find deadly force justifiable. That's why I think he will be found guilty of murder.
Fair. I don't disagree with any part of that analysis, other than that there are more than a couple of people out there who would believe that they were evaluating it from a reasonable perspective. As a black man in America, I'm in a tent and some white kids start pushing me around, and because the society is so dangerous for me that I react on an instinct, and do something that might not be optimal, but in the panic of the moment was justified from a reasonable perspective because I have to protect myself. And acting in self-defense is something that carries a lot of conservative cultural cachet. So that could factor into other potential jurors being sympathetic with the black man's experience of being in a situation like that they couldn't quite experience, but they can still respect, and the idea of self-defense resonates with them, and so they get on board. We will see in due time. That'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.